Mary talk about these other regional artists. So please give a warm welcome to Mary Wyrick.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Hall Walls. Rebecca Wing asked me to speak about artists who inspire me. So I chose 8 artists, and I'm going to focus on the theme of current representations of women in their art. First, you have Eric Evensick. You've probably seen this work. Eric paints about fairy women and mythological entities. One thing that he's, I'm going to point out the fairy women. He uses traditional figure painting techniques that also inspire me, and he represents people from stories that he feels are being lost, stories that used to be oral traditions, stories from cultures all over the world that are, some of them dying, or at least the fairies that they and other entities that they once believed in, people don't believe in any longer. So that's one of the things that Eric is thinking about, is the loss of folk tales and mythology. He's also interested in the loss of landscape and degradation of environment. The landscape is based on an Albert Bierstadt painting. Albert Bierstadt, the Hudson River School painter, who was also painting with the idea that the landscape was going away even back then. And then also there are dinosaurs who are now extinct. Interesting that the dinosaurs wouldn't have lived in this kind of landscape, and the dinosaurs didn't coexist with humans. So what you have is a world from Eric's imagination. The title of this is Vanguard. The vanguard is the fairy women who are diving into a new world to set the stage for more fairy tribe to follow. And I like this idea of an invasion of women. Again, they're based with traditional figure painting techniques. He uses photographs to paint them, so in some ways they look a little contemporary. Eric won an award for this painting from Sandra Furman, who said, "I want to be those women." And I thought that's interesting for a curator to say, "I want to be those women." And I think the picture of a woman in a piece of art and the figure brings a subjective response. This painting also represents an archaic concept of fairies. The idea of what fairies are has changed over time. We have a Tinkerbell kind of Disney idea of fairies, but that's not what fairies were to people in the past. One of Eric's books that I've finally found time to read for this lecture, by Diane Purkis, called At the Bottom of the Garden, talks about how fairies used to be kind of nasty, scary, evil entities. They were formidable. They symbolized transitions and transformations. And the conceptions of fairies, according to Purkis, were born out of fear. Fear of the death, fear of dark. And fairies appeared at junctures in people's lives, at birth, at death. Another interesting idea that Eric uses that I'm inspired by is the idea of liminal space, or space that where change happens, a boundary where you're moving, you're crossing over from one state of being to another. You've left something behind, you're crossing over. Again, I like that idea, and I like the idea of the painting being a liminal space waiting for your interpretation. So now I think we're going to go to Bruce Adams. This is Bruce Adams' chair triptych. It's a long 72-inch triptych, 30 inches tall. This was in his show just last summer at Big Orbit. He has been using traditional figure painting techniques for a couple of decades. In his artist talk for this show, he said, rather than talk about the art, I'd rather hear what you think about the art. I'd rather get your responses to the art. And one of my responses was, well, the women do meet your gaze, and they aren't passive. They're firmly in the painting, and they have personality. They're individuals. Bruce had a show in 2007, and Sandra Furman, again, wrote about Bruce's relentless inquiries into the history of art and representation. In the catalog for that show, Bruce referenced Magritte, and everyone who took art history knows that Magritte painting of the pipe that says this is not a pipe, in French, ce n'est pas un pipe, meaning that it's only a painting, it's not an object, and rejecting that kind of Renaissance idea that a painting is a window and you look through the invisible window and you see life. And so Magritte rejected that idea, and again, Bruce challenged that idea too in his catalog. I think today that Bruce is still making paintings with this, paintings about painting, and not just paintings, but the process of painting and interpretation. He has an interesting way of working with models. He doesn't hire a professional model usually, he says, but he finds everyday people, male and female, but mostly female, and he tells them to bring their own props and pose like they like, and then he paints them from photographs. And so in this triptych, you see a woman ironing, you see the chair, it looks a little retro, but it looks like a new chair that's been made to look retro to me. You also see a woman on the left, I guess the same woman, but in an old vintage chenille robe and talking on a princess phone, not a smartphone, but a princess phone. And interesting that there's the natural setting with the woman looking through the window at the natural setting, but then on the right there's kind of a faux foliage setting. I'm inspired by the foliage and the nature and combining that with the figure. And the one on the right I thought of, I don't know how many of you know about, back in the 70s there was an installation called Woman House in California, some of you know, where women took a house and each woman took a room and they did some chores all day. They performed all day. And one woman, it was Sandra Orgel, ironed all day. People walked in and watched her iron. Kind of like the Medina show. Some of you went to the Medina show where they took over a school and every room had an artist doing something in a classroom. So again, kind of like that in Woman House. And this woman ironing reminds me of the woman ironing in Woman House. John Massier wrote about Bruce Adams in that catalog. He wrote about Adams and his commitment to the principles of illusion. And he said that Bruce's work doubts that meaning holds itself in perpetuity, meaning, of course, that meaning changes. And I thought, that's one of my themes, that meanings change and what women are changes over time. Things aren't fixed, things aren't essential, but they change over time. So I think with Bruce, the paintings then and now are about, more than anything, about painting and viewer reception. So now, Frani Evedon. This is Prayer for Girls from the Roadkill series. She did a series where she actually went out and photographed roadkill, or dead stuff on the highway that was apparently killed by cars. She uses roadkill as a metaphor to respond to political climates in the U.S. She said, "The images in this series are metaphors for the desecration of America. Though this nation was founded on principles of freedom, never have those principles been realized by everyone. These concepts are in the process of erosion as we are exposed to the rhetoric of radical conservatives." You wrote that. So I'm inspired by this kind of overtly political art. So you're looking at a mixed media work that's rather large. I forget how big, like almost 48 inches tall. And what you see on the left is a photograph of a dead woodchuck. And on the right, it's an antique framed poem. Another thing I'm inspired by is ephemera, documents and pages from magazines and things that have been saved and tucked in a file or a shoebox for some reason. This is written by J.P. McAvoy, not the actor, but a writer, and you can look it up on your smartphone. It's called If for Girls, adapted from a Kipling poem. And you can't really read the poems very well, but that's really kind of appropriate because the things in the poem are kind of things that are unattainable for women. It says things like, if you can keep a sweet and gentle spirit in spite of fame or future rank or place, if you can bravely smile when loved ones doubt you and never doubt in turn what loved ones do. Again, there's a whole list of these things that are, hardly attainable, I think. Because we cannot read most of the text, and since it apparently never ends, I think it shows the futility of being the ideal woman. You don't have to be the ideal woman. Prayer for Girls evokes a puzzling aftermath where living, breathing animals and humans are conspicuously absent. So this is Phyllis Thompson. She's here. Phyllis works in series, and this is a monotype. Her art is historical and autobiographical. It explores memories of families, family relationships, and ancestors. I'm inspired by old photographs and scraps of fabric and papers that are saved and used in art. This particular woman was lived in Maryland in an area called Sugarland, which was a community designed, some freedmen in 1871 after the Civil War purchased property for a church and turned it into a community for freed enslaved people. You can read Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, who talked about how when enslaved people were freed, there was wild scenes of ecstasy, but soon people realized they weren't allowed to learn to read, and they had not very many skills, and a lot of them were old and had nowhere to go. These communities that people like Phyllis's ancestor formed, called Sugarland, were communities for people to move to and start a new life after being enslaved. There were 200 or so of these communities across the country. Today, many of the houses that the former enslaved people built have been torn down. One person wrote that they're now horse farms with $1 million houses. A lot of these communities, there's no trace of them, but there are people like Phyllis who are doing revisionist histories and keeping alive the memory of the people at Sugarland. So this is what we did one day, and Phyllis is in the picture. Phyllis says this can be likened to daydreams, meditations, and doodles. Again, old family photos and scraps of ephemera and fabric were mainly saved by women and recycled endlessly. Fabric was made into clothes. Sometimes they made the fabric. The clothes shredded, they were made into quilts and bedspreads. This is Ken watching over. This series includes memories of her childhood. Remember back then, photographs were rare. It's not like today when we have digital photography, but photographs were made by professional photographers. There weren't that many cameras. Sometimes professional photographers traveled around to make pictures, but to have a photograph was a special thing. And if your home burned down or if you moved and lost it, the photographs were usually gone. They couldn't be saved on a cloud or retrieved somehow. This is, she liked patterned cloth. This is Phyllis's grandmother. It connects to memories of her grandmother making these circles that were called yo-yos. They took fabric scraps and cut them into circles and turned them into bedspreads. Phyllis says she wants to evoke the quiet, natural country environment where her grandparents farm. Phyllis said the contrast to the farm and the urban city where I grew up, Philadelphia, continued to intrigue me. Pattern wallpaper with pictures of family, the Singer sewing machine operated with a foot pedal, chickens in the yard and frogs and turtle in a brook behind the house reflect experiences that I nurture. And we forget that we're only a couple of generations from a time when everyone lived on a farm and grew everything they ate and made everything they had and kept it to pass on to the next generation. Okay, now Candace Keegan, she's here. This is Freya's necklace. Freya, I didn't realize until I prepared to show this. Freya was a preeminent Norse goddess. She was famous for love, fertility, beauty, and fine material possessions. She was a practitioner of Norse magic. She controls and manipulates the desires, health, and prosperity of others. She presides over an afterlife realm. She can shapeshift. The word for Friday comes from Freya. I'm inspired by Candace representing herself as Freya with her necklace made of candy, and candy was Candace's nickname. This is a picture of the spirit of justice. There was a controversy with this statue in D.C. where Candace lived. Ed Meese was talking about pornography, and he was in front of this statue, and people decided, well, that can't be. And so under the Ashcroft administration, he was Attorney General, they spent $8,000 to drape the statue to cover it up so she wouldn't be exposed. $8,000 for the drapes. So Candace and three of her artist friends decided to protest that. So this is not a lollipop, and she's thinking about Magritte again. This is not a pipe. This is not a lollipop. This responds to, this is like a protest against censorship of the nude figure. And also Candace was an elementary school teacher, in Washington, D.C., where they have all those museums, and she wasn't allowed to take her kids to museums that had nudity. So they protested this with this art show, and Candace painted herself behind the lollipop and 3 other artists, and the name of the art show was Angst for the Memories. Angst, A-N-G-S-T, Angst for the Memories. A reviewer wrote of the art show, Keegan fights back with whimsical portraits of a topless woman child spiked with self-aware humor that defies an X rating. I'm inspired by Candace painting herself and protesting censorship. This is Candace, Don't Eat the Cake, from a series, Entangled. Entangled just showed in D.C. She just brought it back, or is it still there? Oh, it's still there. So it's still at the, what's the name of it? The Salve Regina Gallery in Washington, D.C. And you see here Candace seems to have entangled herself for dieting, and notice she looks a little bruised and skinned up. Candace paints with oil painting on top of acrylic to get those rich colors. Candace said in a talk a long time ago that she uses herself as a model, but the paintings aren't necessarily her, but they're not her either, meaning I think that they could be any woman, I think. So here you have Candace bound up. Candace said in her artist statement that every woman she knows feels entangled and overwhelmed, and I guess some men too. This is Good Morning Anxiety. Here she has her glasses on. It makes me think of her work life as a professor at Buffalo State College. The artist statement says, this series uses the pliant and internationally ambiguous theme entangled as a metaphor to explore visually the complex web of issues facing women in American society and culture today. This last one by Candace is called Rise, R-I-S-E, Rise. And it occurred to me that there's the Apple laptop, and it occurred to me that the laptop has replaced the scroll and the book and the graduation cap as a symbol of knowledge and power. And Candace has the laptop. It looks like she might be having art in the dark like we are, with a piece of art in the back maybe, or maybe she's at home rehearsing for the talk she's going to give while she's ironing. She's at an ironing board like in the first painting. She's holding 2 dolls, maybe her daughter's dolls, or maybe something for art education that she's going to teach. I was wondering if the ironing board is a signifier of housework, or is it the ironing board from the Bruce Adams painting, because they have adjoining studios. I thought, oh, maybe it's even the same ironing board. I don't know. So here's a new artist, and we're halfway through the slides. This is W. Michelle Harris. She is from Rochester. She's at RIT. She does pixel craft interactive installations. She had a piece at Squeaky Wheel summer before last that you may have seen, and this is a representation of the piece, the top part being how it looks when someone enters the piece, and the bottom part being the faces that compose that top screen. It's called the Can't Breathe Mirror. It's a bittersweet memorial to Black lives lost to police violence. Can't Breathe Mirror reminds me of the African-American man Freddie Gray, who said, I can't breathe, before he was suffocated by police in Baltimore. And this, maybe some of you saw it, it is kind of haunting, but very quiet. In this installation, the world of the breathing is constantly mirrored in a projection composed of a mosaic of mostly smiling faces of portraits of people that were killed in police violence. When you approach the installation, you can see the woman on the top. You can see there's an outline of the woman on the top. As you walk into the installation, a webcam takes your face and the faces of the people who were killed in police violence kind of flip, and your face becomes part of that screen and the video mosaic. This was the one that was at Squeaky Wheel. This is another new one she did called Mammy's Revenge, where she pixelates herself. And close up, you can barely see that the images are also little faces, and many of the images she got from the Jim Crow Museum in Rapids, Michigan. There's a museum of African American memorabilia that shows African American stereotypes, and here is a close-up of some of those. In Mammy's Revenge, she shows how relentlessly African American women stereotypes have been perpetuated, and it also shows how identity is malleable. Again, identity is not an intrinsic thing. It's something that comes from, that is imposed upon you. Here, Harris liberates the stereotype and transforms it by showing how its history and component to her own image. She transforms a negative stereotype into an empowered self-portrait of an artist who uses art to reinterpret history. Okay, here's one more by Michelle Harris. This is the Three Graces. And they are, you can see that they're Barbie dolls. You can see about what size they are. Harris wrote, "This depiction of the mythic goddesses isn't quite the traditional maidens and garlands blithely dancing in the buff. They're eyeing each other's assets. And should you choose to get close enough to do the same and put yourself on view in their mirrored stage, you'll hear a wolf whistle or an appreciative yummy." So you're looking at a little stage with a mirror, and when you walk toward the stage, someone whistles and catcalls and yells at you. You become part of the installation. So when I first looked at it, I thought it looks like they have black eyes. It looks like they've been punched. But Michelle said, no, I took pictures of my own eyes and put my own eyes on the faces of the Barbies. And I thought, that's interesting, so the Barbies are looking through the eyes of the artist. It's interactive because you enter in and see yourself in the mirror. There's also a mud flaps girl at the bottom. See the mud flaps girl? And you've seen those on the other side of large trucks, a kind of a sexy babe on the mud flaps. The viewer sees your own vulnerability, and the artist accepts a vulnerable role. And they are, of course, Barbies. I'm always inspired by Barbies. If you see a piece of art with Barbie in it, usually the artist has something interesting to say. And there's another book that I finally got around to reading that Eric bought by Kim Toffeletti. She's a feminist scholar from Australia. She wrote Cyborgs and Barbie Dolls, and it's really interesting. She wrote about the post-human Barbie. Post-humanism is an idea that's been around for a while. It was first kind of thrown out there in the 70s. It's the idea that we now have a concept of the human form so changed by technology that humanist ideas have come to an end. The definition of humanism, that is, as the idea of the self as self-mastering, as universal, that the self is the locus of existence, independent of history or culture, that you're autonomous and you have free will, etc. So again, this idea that we have of being individuals is kind of being lost with all of the augmentation, with genetics, that you could make a baby the way you want your baby to be. It's not really an individual. The idea of the soul, the idea of being separate people is kind of slipping away. And I think this work kind of says that. They're the Barbies. They're all just alike. They have the same hair. They're all the same form because they're plastic. I don't know, though, if they're wrestling or dancing or getting friendly. I don't know what's going on with these Barbies, but again, I thought, oh, that's post-human. That's a good example of post-human. So I asked Michelle, I said, is it post-human? And she answered, I'm Googling post-human. And then later she answered, I don't think so. I thought, well, I'm going to go into post-human anyway because I think that's the way interpretation is. The artist may not intend something to be there, but you still might get something. That's interpretation. You still might gain some kind of insight. So speaking of Barbie, Rich Tomasello, who's also here, made this work. It's called Sparkle Beach Rhino Barbie. I like the way Rich turned a very traumatic experience into a big series of really interesting artworks. And I think almost everybody knows where Rich got the idea of the rhinoceros. Does everybody know that, or should I go into that? Okay, so Rich says, first he wrote, for several years my art has specifically addressed the loss of innocence. Memories from my childhood, current events, the toy industry, advertising for children specific to gender, and social justice are all topics that appear in my work. He says, I am specifically investigating masculinity, violence, control, peer pressure, and conformity. The rhinoceros comes from a play that you might have seen. I saw a movie of the play on PBS by Ionesco, an absurdist writer, an existential writer. In the play and in the movie that I saw, people start to turn into rhinoceros. And they can't help it. It's like an infection. It's kind of like zombies, but instead of becoming zombies, they become rhinoceros. And you know, you never really see a rhinoceros in the movie that I saw, and I assume not a play because it would be up on a stage. But what you see are people looking out the window at the rhinoceros and saying, you know, there's so-and-so, he turned, and it's ugly out there. They're tearing up everything that they touch. So Rich says after seeing rhinoceros, he had a terrible experience. He was attacked in a bar and was beaten up by 7 people. They circled me, humiliated me, beat me, and ran off without being caught. That night they decided to follow their animal instincts. They became rhinoceros. And by the way, rhinoceros or rhinoceroses is the correct plural for rhinoceros, by the way. I looked it up. So Rich said, years later, I realized that what Ionesco wrote as absurd is a reality today. Society is filled with men who want to control and hold power over those who are weaker. So again, Rich made a whole series of works, paintings of people that were rhinoceroses. What you're looking at here, Rich surveyed his own culture, and I presume took his daughter's Barbies, because most little girls have Barbies, and turned the Barbie into a rhino toy. Rhino toys are toys that help you defend yourself against the world out there of evil and aggression. Barbie, by the way, did you know Barbie started in 1959? That's how old Barbie is. And Barbie isn't as successful as she used to be, but still most little girls seem to have a few Barbies laying around. Barbie's been very ubiquitous. Everybody knows, I mean, I bet everyone here can tell you what Barbie looks like and knows something about Barbies. My mom didn't want me to have a Barbie, but finally I got one, and I still have it. I collect them. I was talking to Bruce about Barbie, and he said, yeah, Barbie's really interesting. It has a lot of cultural meanings. Bruce has a couple of Barbies. Again, Barbie is one of those recognizable things that everybody knows. Again, Tim Toffeletti, remember the one who wrote Cyborgs and Barbies, said one thing interesting about Barbie is that she's a consumer object, but Barbie's also a consumer. If you have Barbie, you have to have clothes, you have to get the car, you have to get the house. If Barbie decides to be a doctor, you need the doctor's office. There's endless things that Barbie needs to buy. In Rich's work, Barbies have gas masks to match their hair color. And I don't know if you can see the little rifles. Each Barbie has a little rifle. Toffeletti wrote that Barbie teaches codes of femininity through standards of dress, body concept, and modes of behavior. And she also embodies the idea that women are commodities to be purchased, consumed, and manipulated. So that was Sparkle Beach Barbie. This is Girl's gas mask, and on the side you see Rich's little girl. Rich wrote about Girl's gas mask. It's a stereotypical advertisement for a girl, which a parody in Girl's gas mask, or breathing tubes and gas masks addressing police violence and Black lives in America. My work aims to shine a light on injustice. Rich said, we live in an absurd world where power is more important than life. My works are about power. Who holds power, those who abuse power, and those who are powerless. So the rhino toys for kids could be a playful defense. I think they're kind of funny. I usually laugh at the rhino toys when I see them. I want to add something to rhino toys, though. I think they tap into a contemporary preoccupation with apocalyptic entertainment. There's so many TV shows and books and movies about the end times and the apocalypse, and I like those. I like apocalypse stories and disaster stories where people have to survive. We saw a huge Smithsonian art show by the artist Trevor Paglin in D.C. this summer. It was enormous. There was room after room of art about surveillance. All of these pictures of places where surveillance was being done, of patches that soldiers wore when they were on CIA secret special ops missions. It was really fascinating. There's also a current exhibit that I didn't see at the Whitney in New York City about conspiracy theories. It's a group show. The reviewer of that show talks about the artist as investigator and references a paranoid style in American art. And when I read that, I thought, yes, a lot of art in entertainment is really paranoid. They play with paranoia. I think the gas mask, Rich's gas mask, has an element of truth because we're already expecting an apocalypse. We're already expecting the end to come, maybe because of our own mortality. It's like we already are expected and we're thinking about it, and we've already considered that it may come so slowly that we won't even notice, but our children will adapt to the new dystopian world. They'll adapt because they won't remember what life used to be like. So our last artist, Lillian Mendez, who I thought would come today, but I don't see her. Lillian made Ay Mi Madre. This is a huge steel sculpture as a tribute to her mother, Ethel Gonzalez Ramirez. It's huge, 10 feet tall by 8 by 8. It is one of her dolls that represent family, friends, acquaintances, and events that contributed to her artistic vocabulary and growth. She said her mother often said this frequently in desperation, "Ay, mi madre." So she used this to name her mother's, the sculpture based on her mother. This was in the Memorial Museum in Rochester. A reviewer, Marcia Morphy, wrote that she was a Barbie-like mother figure. And I didn't see Barbie, but once she says it, the arms look like Barbie. She stands on an altar bed of sand surrounded by candles. Morphy wrote that it's a yin-yang caricature of the Statue of Liberty. There's a contrast of material culture through juxtaposition of commercially produced and natural elements. Mendez also combines material and spiritual worlds by including commercially produced and religious objects. The reviewer wrote, like the candles and decorated holders at the bottom, the decorations serve to focus believers on Catholic iconography in cathedrals and ritual spaces. And this is a detail of Ay, mi madre. Morphy wrote that her face is a collage of people's faces. Neck dressed in strands of 5 and dime jewelry, arms stretched like wings and draped in red chiffon, and body encased in a rosebud-laced gown with little plastic baby dolls hidden in its folds. The iconography she uses is a combination of not only Catholic but also indigenous Puerto Rican images. It commemorates relation with an ancestral past and also provides keepsakes that serve as genealogies and documentations of family. Okay, two more slides. This is called Voudou doll, V-O-U-D-O-U. It's not supposed to be pronounced voodoo, it's Voudou. Lillian says voodoo is the Hollywood version of Voudou. This is just last year she made this print, and she might be showing this at Karen's. Okay, but she's showing work from this series. This was just done last year. Lillian divides her time between Puerto Rico, New York City, and Buffalo. This print is based on objects from Botanica stores. There's some of them here in Buffalo where you can buy things to attract spirits, candles, incense. You can buy things to create your own shrine or your own altar in your home. This particular print is Saint Lazaro, a saint, you can see the head in the back, who lives in the street and cures animals. The coconuts are used in rituals. In the New Year in Puerto Rico, you break a coconut for New Year's. Lillian says the coconuts also represent breast. On the bottom are dancing feet to represent dancing and drumming as part of Voudou ritual. And the red represents sexuality. Again, she says it's not the evil voodoo, but it's a different kind of religion that celebrates sensuality and sexuality. The Voudou ritual, like many indigenous rituals, situates the individual as part of a larger cultural whole instead of an individual. And the last slide, this is called Love and the Tamarind, El Amor y el Tamarindo. It's a mixed media altarpiece that incorporates tamarind, bags of milk, little bags of milk around the edge, human blood, nails, pubic hair, and other found objects. Lillian wrote that it contrasts how sweet love is and how bitter the tamarind, and also represents Voudou practice. Through her collections of culturally charged objects and images, Lillian Mendez comments on ethnic identity as she pays tribute to the past and the syncretic nature of Christian and indigenous spirituality. I think even in a secular culture, religious iconographies can help us think about the world in new ways. I end, this is my 2-sentence conclusion, by urging you to consider looking at diverse forms of art that may stretch your interpretive boundaries. In a free and tolerant society, we can use art to enrich our appreciation of our shared culture by representing it as something in flux with meanings that can be negotiated between audience and artist. So that was a little over 45 minutes. So do you have questions or comments?
Wow. You put a lot of work into that.
Well, I did, but it was interesting. I kept finding all these interesting things that I had been meaning to read, like the catalog to Bruce's show that came out in 2007. I bought one and never read it. So I went, I'll read Bruce's catalog. And a lot of books that Eric had bought that I wanted to read. And so I just didn't have a reason to read them. Okay,
I
Candy.
actually do have a question.
Sure.
So did you, your theme, did you have the theme first and then go seek out artists, or did you have artists floating around in your mind and then come up with the theme, or which way?
Well, the theme given to me was artists who inspire me, and it had to be Western New York artists. So people did start to pop into my head, and they were some of these people, but then I thought, well, I want to do representation of women because I'm painting women, and I thought that's what I want to focus on. And then also interpretation, because interpretation kept coming up, and I've always been interested in interpretation. And then I realized that 8 was really too many, but they asked for the names early in the game, so I couldn't just chop somebody off. So, but you're right, 1 would be easier than. Yeah, 1 would be easier. But well, I was talking to Eric about too, and we couldn't imagine spending a whole hour on just one artist. And I watched a presentation, there was just one artist, and it was interesting, and I really liked to stare at an image, but we thought, you know, it would be hard to keep everybody going with just one artist for the whole time.
That was great, thank you.
Oh.
I tried to get students to come, but they didn't, because they really would have got some.
Okay, well, this is going to be.
All F's.
I think they're making a video of this, or are you? Yeah, they're making a video, and it's going to be on the Hall Walls website, so you can look
the whole
at
thing will be on
the video, right? Isn't that right?
On the YouTube channel, yeah.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
And I was going to warn you about that too. I was going to say, oh, this is going to be on Hall Walls, so just so you know, you'll be on the Hall Walls website. So would the artists that are here like to say anything? We have Candace, Bruce, Rich, Phyllis, and Frani. Would y'all like to say anything?
I said something.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm still photographing roadkill.
Okay.
I found a lovely carcass yesterday. Went down and photographed it. And the issues that I was dealing with when I did that series, which was in 1995, haven't gone away.
Right.
Unfortunately, they're here, and they're even more prevalent than they were then. When I did that series, Clinton was in office. Things weren't quite as bad as they are now. So it calls for another series of that nature.
Okay, good. Yeah, it struck me that what you said is true now, even more than it was then. And I asked Frani back then, aren't you worried about saying things like this, and she said, no, those people don't look at art. They're not interested in art.
And I was teaching at that time also, and, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And Ralph Reed was really coming up at that time, and here he is, he's in a position of real prominence now.
Mhm. Right,
Yeah, David Duke and all those people,
right, yeah, he didn't go away.
you know?
Mhm. Any other questions or comments? Well, thanks so much for coming out on a school night.